It's my privilege to welcome Dr. Gideon Strauss, our recently appointed Associate Professor of Worldview Studies, who has both initiated and will oversee the direction and execution of our new wayfinding program in the Master of Worldview Studies. Gideon, just to warn you, so you can be attuned to accents. I'm helping out in this. Gideon is from South Africa, so when he comes, he'll sound not at all like me, but a little different. We're very thankful indeed that Gideon has actually come to us and said, "I'd like to work with you. I'd like to work at ICS on this program. I like the kind of institution that the Institute of Christian Studies is, in its inclusivity, in its willingness to stretch boundaries, and so he already is making a strong contribution to our community and challenging us in various ways. So it's my privilege once again to welcome Gideon Strauss to the lectern.
It's a great privilege for me to be here in this community on this occasion and on the occasion of the graduation of these students. I owe the Institute for Christian Studies a great deal. As a young South African in the middle 1980s, I met a newspaper editor by the name of Johannes Wessels, who in a little room in the back of his house ran a colporteur business in which he sold books that he imported from Ontario. I thought Jordan Station, Ontario, must be some node of intellectual excellence, given the publications that came from there. But it's from Johannes Wessels that I first bought books by faculty of the Institute for Christian Studies that really changed the way in which I experience the world and in which I live in the world. So it's a surprise and a privilege to be speaking here today. So I am a South African. It's not the only reason why it may be difficult for you to understand what I have to say today. I also have a bad cold. And so during the singing of the hymn a moment ago, my voice went very interesting places. And I'm hoping that I will not relive my puberty during this talk. Let's see. I spent my teens and my 20s in South Africa, among other things, as an activist against the apartheid regime under which I had grown up. And I would say that for those of us who were active against apartheid during those years, there were two things that we dreamt. The one thing we dreamt was that South Africa might become a country that functioned as a democracy in terms of how we made our collective political decisions. One of the slogans of the anti-apartheid movement was, with apologies, one man, one vote. We got it right eventually, one person, one vote, but it was one of the great dreams that we would accomplish a democracy. The other great dream had to do with the reality of apartheid as such. Apartness, rested on the notion that it was necessary for people to be geographically apart. And so it had a great deal to do with land and sorting people out by race and ethnicity across that land. And so one of the great dreams of the anti-apartheid movement was the dream of land reform. And so there's a context there of centuries of colonial displacement of peoples, sometimes genocidally so, in the case of the Khoisan people, and a subsequent history of forced removals during the apartheid and immediately pre-apartheid era, where people were forcibly moved on a very large scale away from where they had lived for a long time to where, under the apartheid regime, they were to preferably live according to those who ran that regime. The forced removals that occurred in South Africa and that would eventually prompt the dream of land reform did not start in 1948 with the official beginning of the apartheid order. They started in 1913, so under the auspices of the British Empire, and the symbolic point to which people would refer when they thought about those forced removals was the Land Act of 1913. It is estimated by the current Department of Land Affairs in South Africa that between 1913 and 1990, about 7.5 million people were forcibly moved in South Africa. And so one of the big points of negotiation when South Africa emerged into its democratic era in the early 1990s was a negotiation around land. And the accomplishment of an agreement over the new Constitution of South Africa in the early 90s had to do with an agreement among the various parties to those negotiations that there would be land reform in the new democratic South Africa, and that that land reform would pay attention to people who were the victims of forced removals between 1913 and 1990. I went back to South Africa just this April, and one of the things that I wanted to pay attention to was the whole issue of land reform for a variety of reasons. I was commissioned to write about this, and I had, in my reading about land reform, become somewhat impassioned about its significance in bringing about change in developing societies. To my shock and horror, it turns out that in the 20 years since the beginning of the democratic era in South Africa, very little had been accomplished with regard to land reform. It is estimated that there are approximately 397,000 valid claims from people who were forcibly removed during that period of time from 1913 that somehow had to be settled within terms that had been negotiated at the beginning of the democratic era. And the understanding was that most of these settlements would not be returning people to land that they had lost, but it would be a financial settlement that would enable them in the new circumstances to find ways to improve their lives. One of the things that I discovered when I interviewed Cheryl Walker, who's one of the 3 or 4 leading scholars of land reform in South Africa, is that at the current pace with which the Department of Land Affairs is dealing with land claims, it is estimated that they will have dealt with these claims approximately 230 years from now. One of the consequences of this reality is that there is, in my experience from conversations with people, more rage amongst black, poor South Africans than there were in the 1980s under the worst repression of the apartheid regime. And it is a rage that has very few conduits politically to give expression to it. The African National Congress, the current government in South Africa, is set, as best as one can see from their practices, on an increased condensation of commercial power in the agricultural sector. So there's an ever smaller number of farmers farming ever more efficiently on ever more land. And they are also in collusion with traditional leaders who maintain a hold on communities where there is no proper land tenure and people are dependent on traditional leaders for access to land, access to housing, access to places to farm. And so it is only very recently, with the emergence of a new political party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, that these people who are effectively landless and filled with rage are able to voice their concerns into the political system in South Africa. So someone who spent my teens and my 20s in the 80s and the 90s dreaming of a post-apartheid South Africa, this new situation fills me with rage. That post-apartheid government has not been able to address the needs of the poorest of the poor in this country, despite having been elected exactly to accomplish that. South Africa has more absolute poverty now than it has had at any prior time. 1 out of every 5 South Africans are not able, with the resources available to them, to feed themselves adequately in terms of daily dietary requirements. South Africa is now a significantly more unequal country than it was during the apartheid era. It is one of the most unequal countries in the world. The town where I spent all of April, or the city, Cape Town, and then Stellenbosch, are also the most unequal, beautiful, beautiful places, and the most unequal places in all of South Africa. So what does one do when you have had these dreams of building a nation and building a state, and you find that the realities of accomplishing such nation building and such state building are very difficult and frequently frustrated by those next to whom you struggled for change? In my case, I find myself in a field of tension that is shaped by feelings that I find resonant in the passages that we read from the Scriptures just before I started talking. I am not going to offer a profound exegesis of these passages, and I am not going to try and make an historical argument in relation to these passages. I am not going to try and build some kind of theology of exile, which I would think would be an inappropriate theology for the South African situation. And I am also slightly bashful and terrified of the erudition ranged around me with regard to such exegesis. What I will claim is that when I read these passages, as I do frequently, these are among those little nodes in the Scriptures to which I return time and again, because I find that they offer me challenge and solace. They resonate with what I experience, and they give me words with which to speak to God and speak to others. But I find myself frequently thinking about these passages because in Psalm 137 there is a poet giving voice for a community and giving voice to rage, a murderous rage, actually, if you look at the final lines of the poem. John Goldingay, who is an Old Testament theologian whose work I appreciate, says that the Psalter gives us 150 examples of things that you can say to God. And so Psalm 137 for me is something I can say to God when I think about the situation of the 1 out of 5 South Africans who are unable to feed themselves well, the 200,000 households who live on rural land and have not been given land tenure, the roughly 1 million people who make up those households and who are not provided with seed or water or fertilizer or tools or training with which to make use of the land on which they find themselves. And then Jeremiah 29 says that when you find yourself in a really bad situation, you garden. And so for me, these two passages create this field of tension in which I'm able to make some sense of the challenge of nation building in South Africa. I don't think that this is a peculiar place to find oneself. I don't think that it's a place that's unique to people who are political activists in developing nations. I think that the honest anguish of Psalm 137 and the faithful presence counseled in Jeremiah 29 create a space in which most of us find ourselves every now and again as we make our efforts at culture making and community building. I think that this is a space in which the people who are trying to build this community, the Institute for Christian Studies, find themselves with some frequency. And I think that you, as graduates, when you graduate, will find yourselves sometimes needing words like these, like Psalm 137 or Jeremiah 29, to situate yourselves. The gardening council in Jeremiah 29 reminded me that much culture making and community building is like gardening. You need tools and you need a skill, but you also need good soil and you need rain to happen. I spoke to a smallholder farmer from the Cape Town area who talked about 5 successive failed crops because of the absence of rain in the drought that South Africa is experiencing. But the gardening passage also reminded me of one of my favorite songs, David Mallett's Garden Song. I don't know if you know this, and I dare not sing it, but inch by inch, row by row, gonna make this garden grow, gonna mulch it deep and low, gonna make it fertile ground. Inch by inch, row by row, please bless these seeds I sow. I first heard this song on an album by some Mennonite guy. It's recorded at Goshen College, and I heard it in the 80s. And as I heard it, it was roughly the same time that I first heard these famous words by Abraham Kuyper that says that, the ultimate land claim is that Jesus claims every square inch or every thumbprint patch of the world. And that somehow that means something about our claims with regard to the world, but it also means that we have someone we can trust in with regard to this land. So when I sing the garden song, I sing, inch by every square inch. What does it look like to be gardeners, broken-hearted gardeners, nation building or institution building, trying to build a life of scholarship in a world in which it is appropriate sometimes to pray Psalm 137, necessary frequently to hear the letter that was recorded in Jeremiah 29. I think that to live in that space, one needs to listen to guidelines for artists that I first read in the 80s in Rainbows for the Fallen World by Cal Seerveld. One of the chapters in that book that profoundly changed me, the introduction was for me the big deal, Psalm 19. But the chapter that really meant a great deal for me had to do with how to be an artist in God's world. And Cal Seerveld offered these 5 guidelines. And I think it's guidelines that remind me of Jeremiah 29. Cal said to artists, become filled with the wisdom of the Holy Spirit. Conceive art as work and undergo its training like a trade. Distill a faithful Christian art historical tradition in your own blood and pioneer its contribution in our day. Integrate yourself as a band of Christian artists with Christian task forces in other cultural areas in order to reach out as a peoplehood of God to the public at large and persevere in unfolding art historically, with a generations-long patience and hope. As I unexpectedly thought about giving this address over the past week, and doing so against the backdrop of the month I spent in South Africa, is the last of those injunctions that came to mind for me as a gentle counsel. Some years after first publishing Rainbows for the Fallen World, Cal wrote in Bearing Fresh Olive Leaves that he still thought that those were the best guidelines he could offer artists, and I would transpose them to all of our crafts. But that he would want to specifically emphasize the 4th and the 5th of those guidelines. And he writes, we do not bring Christ's rule complete to the earth in our lifetime. And we need a vision that will reach across the generations. When I read Jeremiah 29 and read the counsel to have children, to me it gives a sense of the reality of cultural engagement in God's world being a transgenerational responsibility. As I thought about that transgenerational responsibility and that long, patient involvement in God's world, I thought about the wine farms that I visited during this month in Stellenbosch. These are beautiful, beautiful farms. Some of them have been farmed for 400 years. They were initially established by Huguenot refugees from France who made their way to the Cape of Good Hope and were given land, and on that land they started growing vineyards and they started making wine. And I thought about the many generations of faithful cultivation of land that was involved with those wine farms. It resonated with me with regard to the need to be faithful for generations if one were to try and build a nation in South Africa. Perhaps the need to be faithful for generations if one wants to do scholarship in a community like this. And then I spent time with my friend Rupert Koopman. Rupert is a botanist. He knows the fynbos flora of the Cape better than anyone I know about. And he took me out into the Strandveld, the beach country of the Cape area, and we looked at plants. And we talked about the fact that as someone who is racially designated as colored, the name he bears, Koopman, is the name of the man who raped his great-great-great-grandmother. And those would have been wine farmers of the Western Cape, who so faithfully cultivated that land over the generations, after having genocidally removed the Khoisan people who had been on that land beforehand. And I recognized my own complicity as an Afrikaans person in that very complex history. And I think it's necessary for us to recognize that as we are faithful across the generations, as we cultivate inch by square inch, that all of these square inches have deep histories. And there are histories in which we have to recognize our own complicitness in wrong, and nonetheless, as we rage against the wrong, garden and have also academically generations to follow. Thank you.